Marc Billot, who is a researcher at the CNRS, is working in the biomedical sciences, especially on cancer, and he will chair the session this afternoon.
Okay, so good morning to everybody, and thank you very much, Stephanie. It's a great pleasure to be here today. So we'll move straight to the first speaker, who's Jaana EIGI. So she's a research fellow at Tartu University in Estonia, and the title of her talk, well, it's on the slide, Objectivity, Participation, Democracy, bringing together Helen Longino's ideas about objectivity and analyses of democratic participatory practices. Okay, so you have 45 minutes for the talks, and we'll have 15 minutes of questions.
Good afternoon, everybody. Before I begin, a quick question. Can you hear me all right? Good. First, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's an honor for me to be here and a pleasure for me to be here. Second, I must say that when I received the program of the conference, I realized that my talk will have to meet two challenges. First, I will be talking about some arguments in the presence of the authors. Second, I realized that my talk is going to be right after lunch. So staying awake may be somewhat of a challenge for me, but I will do my best. And now to the issue that I want to discuss in my talk. Contemporary philosophy of science is characterized by growing interest in the social organization of science and ways to improve it. There may be interesting questions about the philosophical strengths of this argument. I believe that there are also some interesting practical questions. Above all, there is the question about the possibility of putting these philosophical ideas into practice. I previously suggested that for answering that question, it is helpful to look at developments in science policy. Specifically, I focused on two accounts. One is Helen Longino's account of scientific objectivity as freedom from individual biases, achieved through an interaction of a variety of perspectives. The other is Mark Brown's discussion about epistemic benefits of wider representation of various groups' perspectives in science policy. I argued that there are important parallels between the two accounts. Given these similarities, I suggested that some developments in science policy may be treated as if one of their aims were epistemic improvement, the philosophical account recommends. Analysis of these political developments can then be used for understanding possibilities to implement a philosophical proposal in practice. In the first part of my talk, I will summarize this argument. In the second part of my presentation, I will look at my argument in the context of some research on particular details of public participation initiatives. Specifically, I will discuss analysis of different types of the public that participatory initiatives may seek. One of the most important contrasts here is between lay experts, invited for the knowledge and relevant perspectives, and representatives of the pure public, meant to represent ordinary citizens. I will describe some tensions that may exist between different types of participation, and I will discuss the implications of this issue for my original argument. Looking at philosophy of science of several recent decades, one may be struck by the growing interest in the social aspects of science. Some of these philosophical arguments also contain proposals how science should be organized or reorganized. James Brown's proposal to socialize biomedical research, Philippe Kitcher's well-ordered science, Janet Kurani's socially responsible science, and Miriam Salomon's proposal to take social empiricism into account when planning and funding research are some examples. At the same time, contemporary science policy is also characterized by considerable interest in democratization. Over at least several decades, there have been numerous attempts to make science and science policy more socially relevant, accountable, democratic, open to the public, and so on. Numerous experimental forms of democratization have been tested as means to achieve that, including citizen juries, polls, public debates, consensus conferences, and so on. Given these parallel developments, it seems natural to ask what they may mean for each other. As I stated at the beginning, I am especially interested whether we can learn something about the feasibility of philosophical proposals. As the matter stands presently, it is highly unlikely that an actual political development will look exactly like a specific philosophical proposal. For example, Maxence Gaillard compares the recommendations of Kitcher's well-ordered science with the development of French public debates on nanotechnology. Gaillard demonstrates that both the practical organization and the results of the French experiment were different from what Kitcher's model of well-ordered science presupposes. Accordingly, I believe that discussing very specific philosophical proposals may not be very fruitful. Instead, I propose to discuss certain shared ideas that may underlie both the philosophical proposal and changes in science policy. So, in this part of my talk, I discuss certain similarities between one approach to objectivity in philosophy of science and some ideas about objectivity in political theory. Given the important differences between the two spheres, one should not expect a perfect fit with the philosophical ideal. I suggest that philosophical proposals should be approached as a starting point. There are a set of ideas that are to be applied and developed into a more definite form in a specific context. Science policy analyses are necessary to learn about such specific contexts and their obstacles and possibilities. As an example, I discuss an analysis that shows how certain development may be both politically motivated and epistemically beneficial, and how they are shaped by a specific political and social situation. This analysis comes from Alison Wiley's work on the development of professional ethics and collaborative research in American archaeology. The starting point for my discussion is Longino's account of objectivity. Longino puts the notion of objectivity at the center of her discussion of science. This approach stems from her approach to evidential reasoning. Longino points out that scientific hypotheses are based on empirical evidence, but they are underdetermined by it. Hypotheses also include concepts that are not used in description of the data, and thus cannot be simply derived from it. Thus, something else is always necessary to connect particular evidence with a particular hypothesis. Longino calls this necessary element background assumptions. Background assumptions enable evidential reasoning. At the same time, background assumptions are not themselves a part of empirical evidence specified when justifying a hypothesis. Many of these assumptions may be explicated and justified by appealing to some empirical evidence, shared methodological rules, or epistemic values. However, background assumptions may also include individual or community biases. This possibility creates doubts about the objectivity of hypothesis acceptance. Longino argues that social processes of criticism can prevent such uncritical acceptance of problematic assumptions. Hypotheses offered by individuals do not acquire the status of recognized knowledge automatically. Before becoming a part of community knowledge, they are subject to criticism, replication, modification, and extension by other members of community. In this process, background assumptions may be exposed, and their justification or modification may be required. As a result of these collective practices, individual biases can be prevented from entering community knowledge. Longino also describes conditions that are necessary to enable successful collective criticism. These conditions are public venues for criticism, uptake or responsiveness to criticism, existence of shared norms, and tempered equality of intellectual authority among the participants. In addition, Longino stresses the importance of a wide variety of perspectives, so that commonly shared assumptions will not remain invisible. Objectivity, in the sense of being non-subjective, is thus inseparable from intersubjective criticism. Ultimately, openness to vigorous criticism is the only way a community can justify its claims to objective knowledge. Quote, "The only non-question begging response to challenge must be, we are open to criticism, we do change in response to it. And while we may not have included all possible perspectives, we have included as many as we have encountered, or more than others have." Unquote. Longino remarks that objectivity of science in this sense is not in principle different from objectivity in other spheres, such as philosophy. Elsewhere, she makes an even more general claim, characterizing her account of objectivity as an explication of what objectivity means. Even though I argue that Longino's conception of objectivity captures certain widespread ideas about it, it is important to acknowledge that it is not the full explication of the meaning of objectivity. For example, Heather Douglas has argued that there are several different and irreducible senses of objectivity. The kind of objectivity that Longino describes covers only some of these senses. Lorraine Stone has shown that the sense of objectivity is not timeless either. Thinking about objectivity as freedom from subjectivity emerged at a particular point in the history of science. There have been other senses of objectivity besides it. Longino's account thus only attracts attention to one understanding of objectivity. I suggest that despite incompleteness, the focus on just this aspect may be helpful for establishing a contact between Longino's account and some political science analysis of science policy. In my presentation, I discussed the ideas that Mark Brown develops in the context of his analysis of representation in science and democracy. Brown distinguishes 5 crucial elements of representation and discusses practices and institutions that enable realization of these different senses. The elements in question are authorization and accountability of the representatives, public participation and deliberation, and resemblance between representatives and those being represented. The understanding of representation as resemblance introduces themes related to objectivity as a result of critical discussion from multiple points of view. Brown proposes to think about resemblance in terms of social perspectives. Making representatives resemble the constituents can thus be understood in terms of making social perspectives present among the public, also present among those representing them. A social perspective grows out of certain shared experiences and provides basis for shared concerns and questions, although it does not necessarily result in one shared opinion. These experiences may be common for some social group. At the same time, there may be different perspectives within a group, and no perspective common for all its members. Specifying the relevance of a perspective to the issue at hand and attributing it to a particular group is always open to challenge. The perspective may also change in the process of deliberation, and this changeability is important for the possibility of productive deliberation. Nevertheless, social perspectives provide something deliberation can start with. Brown argues that there is a number of benefits associated with an increase in the number of perspectives. First, it may improve what Brown calls the deliberative validity. Understanding of a problem may be expected to improve when it is approached from various perspectives. As Brown writes, quote, "The more perspectives involved, the more likely that errors and biases will be identified and corrected, unquote. Elsewhere he adds, this time in terms of epistemic quality, that persons who have been long involved with particular issues, including technical experts, tend to develop blind spots. This may be remedied by including new perspectives. Second, increasing the number of perspectives may improve public credibility of decisions. That makes them more responsive to concerns of all groups potentially affected by them. Third, it may help to diminish sense of alienation with respect to politics, including science policy. To the degree that marginalized groups self-identify with a particular perspective, inclusion of that perspective may help them to feel involved. So, the associations between objectivity, absence of subjective bias, and inclusive critical discussion are also recognized in the political sphere. As Brown shows, widening public participation in science policy has other motivations besides improving its objectivity through inclusive discussion. As a result, epistemic improvement may have a relatively low importance in political developments. Still, some of these developments may bring epistemic improvement that is similar enough to what Longino's account recommends for improving objectivity. Accordingly, I suggest using these developments to learn how an attempt of epistemic improvement through more inclusive discussion may fare in practice. Studying these developments may be helpful for understanding how big is political and public willingness to initiate such a change, and what conditions it takes for it to be successful. In order to support the suggestion with a specific example, I now turn to the discussion of a development that combines political motivation and epistemic benefit. Wiley analyzes recent changes in the practices and self-understanding of American archaeology. Towards the end of the 20th century, archaeology was facing a number of challenges. One of the most important among them was the need to rethink the relations with indigenous and descendant communities. These communities were increasingly demanding more control over archaeological material that they saw as a part of the cultural tradition. The rights of the indigenous peoples to control their heritage were also finding recognition in the law. Most prominently, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act became the federal law in 1990. In addition to this external pressure, there is also a growing recognition among archaeologists about the necessity to pursue a more culturally sensitive and respectful approach to archaeology. The response of the archaeological profession that Wiley describes took the form of the new ethical guidelines adopted by the Society for American Archaeology. The notion of stewardship takes the center stage in these guidelines. Archaeologists are seen as stewards of archaeological material for the rest of society. In this role, they have responsibilities before other groups that have interest in this material, and they also have duties of communication, cooperation, and accountability. Quote, responsible archaeological research, including all levels of professional activity, requires an acknowledgement of public accountability and a commitment to make every reasonable effort, in good faith, to consult actively with affected groups with the goal of establishing a working relationship that can be beneficial to all parties involved. Unquote. As a result of these changes, some degree of public participation when making decisions about archaeological research is now a part of the practices of American archaeology. these changes may be seen as primarily motivated by the considerations of legitimacy and inclusion that Brown describes. In addition to that, Wiley argues that this collaborative practice sometimes has the potential to be epistemically productive. Quote, while the impetus for these collaborations is often, in the first instance, moral and political, they arise from demands for respect, reciprocity, consultation. Increasingly, they are also robustly epistemic. Unquote. Wiley discusses in detail one example of such a successful collaboration. In the collaborative study of the frozen human remains found in British Columbia in 1999, the questions of interest for the local indigenous people turned out to be of relevance for the traditional archaeological questions as well. For example, the community request to find the living relatives of the deceased provided information that forced archaeologists to rethink the understanding of the geographic distribution and relations of local communities. Wiley uses this case as the starting point for discussing the possibility of a more collaborative and pluralistic practice in archaeology. Wiley advocates what she calls dynamic pluralism. Dynamic pluralism characterizes research practice that takes the knowledge claims and perspectives of non-scientific communities seriously and seeks to interact with them. For Wiley, doing this kind of pluralistic practice allows realizing more fully the commitment to being open to criticism. Similarly to Longino, she sees that commitment as central for science. So, Wiley's analysis provides some support for my suggestion that an initiative for more inclusive scientific practice may have positive epistemic impact, even if its more important motivations are ethical and political. I believe that such developments may help to answer some questions that are crucial for philosophical proposals about epistemic improvement. In particular, analysis of actual cases can be helpful for understanding how an increase in public participation may be possible in a specific political and cultural context. For example, Wiley's analysis of the changes in American archaeology shows how the possibilities for more inclusive science may be opened by changes in researchers' ideas about appropriate research practice. In addition to that, Wiley also shows the crucial role of specific laws and regulations in changes in the ethics code of the discipline. These changes in turn may be a response to a variety of developments in the wider political and cultural context of the discipline, where actions and activism of various groups may play a role. I suggest that analyzing such developments in research and science policy may be one of the tasks for philosophy of science. As I stressed at the beginning of the paper, the philosopher's argument in this case should not be taken as a ready-made model of the desirable change. Instead, the general ideas, such as Longino's, can serve as the starting point for exploring more specific norms and regulations that emerge in particular contexts. I thus suggest to approach Longino's ideas about objectivity as underdetermined. They capture some necessary conditions for objectivity, but they are not in themselves sufficient. In order to understand what forms these general principles can take in specific context, it is still necessary to analyze specific legal and institutional arrangements and specific research communities. So far, I have argued that political initiatives to increase inclusiveness may harmoniously include some elements of epistemic improvement. However, as Brown stresses, the main interest there is likely to be directed at other consequences, seen as beneficial for democratic society. Quote, efforts to increase the diversity of social perspectives in public deliberation aim in part to remedy long histories of systemic discrimination against socially disadvantaged groups. They also seek to provide symbolic representation of these groups, in part to encourage political engagement by group members. These justifications for the representation of diverse social perspectives do not apply to scientific disciplines." Unquote. As a result, these non-epistemic considerations may pull in the directions different from those that philosophers would prefer. For example, the social perspectives that merit inclusion to address some pressing issues of marginalization may not be epistemically most fruitful. I believe that this is an important issue. It may mean that even in the situation when the number of public participation initiatives is increasing, relatively few of them will be of epistemic interest. Nevertheless, I believe that even a relatively limited number of them may provide important information for philosophers of science. Additionally, I believe that non-epistemically motivated developments may offer an important opening precisely because of the ubiquity of non-epistemic reasons. One may wonder whether there exists political will to implement changes proposed on epistemic grounds by philosophers. Yet the persistence of the trend for democratization of science policy shows that there exists some interest in making science and science policy more inclusive. By focusing on these developments, the philosopher may already have actual cases of increased participation in science to study. In the presentation so far, I argue that the existence of some shared intuitions about the benefits of inclusive discussion in philosophy of science and science policy may help to bring the two spheres into contact. I mentioned the possibility that different motivations may mean the preference for including social perspectives on some non-epistemic grounds. But I suggested that it may not be a decisive objection. In the remainder of my presentation, I want to discuss a related problem that I believe to be more serious. A number of analyses of public participation have demonstrated there may be different expectations about the public and its roles in different participation initiatives. Some of these roles may be impossible to realize simultaneously. As a result, a participatory initiative may look like the democratization of science from one point of view, and as a failure of democratization from the other. In this part of the presentation, I will discuss how the situation may arise. I will also discuss how I now propose to modify my original argument in the light of this problem. Different analyses of public participation initiatives may propose slightly different classifications of the relevant publics. For example, an analysis may distinguish citizens, consumers, and advocates as the three relevant groups. A different tripartite classification may talk about citizens, consumers, and lay experts as the three groups to be invited. There may also be four-part classifications. For example, the distinction between the general public, the pure public, the affected public, and the partisan public. I suggest that ultimately the most important contrast here is between two groups. On the one hand, there is the public in general, with no special interest in knowledge concerning the issue. On the other hand, there are groups of the public who have knowledge or experience that are relevant for the issue, or who have a special stake in the issue. As the analyses of public participation demonstrate, these different roles for the public may be impossible to perform together. The expectations inherent in these roles are such that the better representatives are at one role, the less suitable they are for the other. Representatives of the groups that have relevant experience or interests may be good for improving the epistemic quality of decisions. One could say that this is precisely the role for the public that Longino and Brown recommend. At the same time, having this knowledge and interest make these representatives different from the general, ordinary public. Accordingly, there may be a concern that they cannot legitimately represent its perspectives. Moreover, there may be a concern that representatives of the groups with special interests may not be capable of sufficient openness when taking part in participatory initiatives. Representatives of the public in general may be expected to be more capable of acting as disinterested and public-spirited citizens. However, it is expected to be possible precisely thanks to the lack of previous knowledge or strong opinions. Given this incompatibility of roles, it is even possible to argue that involving representatives of the public with relevant experience may do nothing for democratization of science and science policy in general. This is the point that Collins and Evans make in their discussion of expertise. They argue that expertise is not necessarily limited to the officially recognized certified experts. Some laypersons may possess non-certified, experience-based expertise. Such experience-based experts ought to be included in technical decision-making alongside with other experts. Yet it is their expertise that serves as the basis for inclusion. They are not representative of non-expert laypersons. According to Evans and Plaus, neither type of expert can be seen as representatives of the general public. They represent their own expert communities, and they can only speak for them. The gap between experts and general citizenry means that there exists the problem of legitimacy that experts face. Crucially, experience-based experts face it as much as traditional certified experts. In order to address this problem, Evans and Plaus recommend also inviting non-expert laypersons, defined by their disinterestedness and lack of special knowledge. If one takes this argument seriously, the kind of public participation that Longino's ideas support no longer looks like democratization of science. Rather, it looks like the extension of expert community, while non-expert laypersons remain without representation. There are some similarities between the issue I'm discussing now and the earlier discussion of different motivations as Brown describes them. In both cases, there are reasons to require public participation that is not based on the epistemic contribution that representatives may provide. However, I believe that there's an important difference as well. Earlier, I focused on the problem that non-epistemic motivations, like the desire to address marginalization, may prioritize the involvement of the social groups whose perspectives are not necessarily most promising epistemically. In response to this possibility, I suggested that at least sometimes epistemic and non-epistemic motivations may converge. The groups whose involvement is most desirable for ethical and political reasons may at the same time be the groups who have relevant experience and perspectives. I believe that while this discussion of the involvement of indigenous communities in archaeology illustrates this possibility, in the case of contrast between general citizens and lay experts, this kind of coincidence is impossible. The qualities that make a person lay expert also distinguish that person from an ordinary citizen. Presumably, this undermines one's legitimacy as a representative of ordinary citizens' perspectives. So in this case, there seems to be the need to organize different types of public participation in parallel. The motivation for epistemic improvement and other motivations need to be kept separate. This issue obviously has implications for my earlier optimistic argument. I will now briefly discuss my response to them. First, I believe that recognizing this problem should make me somewhat less hopeful about the usefulness of political developments for philosophical proposals. As I suggested earlier, the convergence of several different motivations to invite representatives of a specific social group may make it more likely that they will be invited. Even in the absence of special epistemic interest, the motivation to involve the group may be supported by ethical and political considerations. In the situation where participation by representatives of lay experts and general public is contrasted, there cannot be such happy convergence. The invitation of lay experts has to rely on the motivation for epistemic improvement alone. This makes the possible failure of this motivation more worrying. At the same time, the identification of this motivation in numerous public participation initiatives gives some hope that there is in fact interest in epistemic improvement through wider inclusion of relevant experiences. Accordingly, there may still be actual cases to study in order to understand how this kind of epistemic improvement can work in practice. So, the diminished hope in this case concerns the number of usable initiatives rather than the very existence. Second, I believe that a valuable lesson of this analysis of participatory initiatives is the importance of thinking clearly about the aims of participation, the type of the public, and the process of engaging it. So, using Longino's ideas to support public participation in science, it is important to be aware of similar initiatives and their expectations concerning the invitation of lay experts, affected public, or partisan public. It is also important to be aware of rather different expectations about the suitable type of the public when it comes to the representation of citizens in general. Third, and relatedly, I believe that an important lesson here is the need to think more carefully what democratization of science means. Longino's ideas support the involvement of laypersons with relevant knowledge and perspectives. Does it constitute democratization of science? Several years ago, when I first formulated my original argument, I would have said yes without reservations. Now, the arguments about different types of public participation make me think that it may still count as making science more democratic, but only in some specific respect. I began my presentation with the observation that increasingly often there are philosophical proposals about organization of science. Specifically, I focused on Longino's account of objectivity as supporting the call for greater inclusiveness in science and science policy. An obvious question is whether such proposals could ever be realized in practice. To my knowledge, there has never been an actual experiment. However, there have been public participation initiatives that relied on similar ideas about connections between wider participation and epistemic quality. I suggested that thanks to this similarity, these cases of public participation can be used to learn about the conditions that are necessary to realize such epistemic improvement. To support my suggestion, I discussed Brown's account of representation to show the presence of these ideas in political reflections on public participation. I also discussed Wiley's analysis of changing practices in archaeology as a real-life example of positive epistemic change and the factors that enabled it. In the second part of my presentation, I showed how my initial optimism was curbed by the recognition that there may be tensions between different forms of public participation. I was specifically concerned with the difference between the types of participation that focus on lay experts and those that seek representation of general citizenry. I concluded that the recognition of the tension should lead to more awareness of different forms of public participation and different senses in which they can be called democratization. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Are there questions? Yes.
Lovely, thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation. As you can guess, I can have a bunch of questions, but the one thing, how to formulate this, I think Wiley builds much of her argument on standpoint epistemology. So the indigenous communities have an epistemically valuable viewpoint to the things the archaeologists are studying, and that's one of the reasons, the epistemic rationale for taking their ideas into account in archaeological research. And this is obviously a very different argument from the ones, for instance, Kitcher and Douglas defend, because they are clearly talking about just the general public, and it's about democratization of scientific knowledge production, not about including more epistemically interesting standpoints. But still, even in Wiley's example, now I'd like to make a distinction Stephanie Salomon has suggested, that we can look at extra academic participants in research projects as stakeholders of some sort or as experts. And in the STS literature, there's lots of discussion of democratization of expertise, but I think this distinction sort of makes it clear that how to formulate this into a question? Well, so even in Wiley's example, what she thinks should be, we are learning from the indigenous communities is we are taking their values into account. So there is a certain similarity between the aims defended by, for instance, Douglas has written about, or as you talk about Longino. So the philosophical argument is related to values in science, but we can see so I'm sort of claiming that the situation is even more complicated than the one you described, because we have also quite a lot of extra academic participation in science where it's only expertise. It's just, we have someone who's extremely good at doing something that works outside of academia and is involved in a collaborative project of some kind. So I was very happy with when you demanded for more precision, precise distinctions to the discussion of democratizations of scientific knowledge production, because only part of the breaking of the boundaries of science going on right now is related to democratization. But I still think that even the cases you were talking about, they had something of the democratization, the aims of democratization in them. There are also cases that have very little to do with those aims. I wonder, did this come? Is this a question?
I'm still not sure what exactly is the question, but as a kind of response, I think one important thing is to consider what different things can be called democratization. And when I was thinking about my original argument about those connections between Longino's ideas and various participatory initiatives, then I was thinking about the involvement of those lay experts, people with relevant knowledge, and also possibly the involvement of stakeholders, people who happen to be affected by the issue and possibly have some relevant perspectives. But I think reading about different types of public initiatives has made me realize that there may also be arguments for involving citizens that are neither, who do not have expert knowledge and who do not have a distinctive stake in the issue. They're supposed to represent the ordinary majority. And I think if we look at the arguments such as Longino's and Wiley's, they do not really lend support to this kind of public participation. I think the one exception may be Heather Douglas' discussion of public involvement for discussing relevant values. She has written that in local cases, where there are identifiable stakeholders, it is good to involve those stakeholders. But in other cases where there are no such identifiable stakeholders, or where the issues are potentially global, it makes sense to involve representatives of the public in general. And she specifically talks about organizing consensus conferences. And consensus conferences are one of the favorite examples in those studies of types of public participation, because they're usually connected with those rationales for involving ordinary citizens, the so-called pure public.
Yeah, so yeah, also thank you for this presentation. I also like the Wiley case, but I have to think about that a bit more. But so my question is a bit about the relation between participation and democratization. So if you think about democracy, I think everybody will agree that the core of it is having a vote, that you can influence or be part of making decisions. And so having a voice, that you can talk about things, are included in participation as such. Okay, it's a part of democracy, but it does not have that core element of having a vote. So and I wondered about how you see this. In quite a bit of the literature, I see that people think, okay, if you participate, that's democratization. But if you say, well, do they really have a say in what should happen? And there are enough cases where there is participation, but at the end, well, things go as they always go. The rich get richer, and the poor stay poor, to cite Leonard Cohen. So the point about the vote and the decision.
Again, I think it's that issue of thinking more carefully about what democracy means and democratization means. As I admit at the end of my talk, I wasn't quite aware of these issues when I first formulated my argument. And I think at that time, I strongly associated democracy with a deliberative approach to democracy. So opening certain locations for public representatives to participate in deliberation counted as democratization for me. But I think that issue of making a difference was already important for me back at that time. That's why I really liked that example from Wiley's, because there those more participatory practices have made actual difference. If you look at that research on different forms of public participation, then quite often those forums for democratic deliberation, they're advisory at best, and they're pure experiments most often. So for example, in most cases, those consensus conferences, citizen juries and so on, they are not integrated into political decision-making. And so I still think it's important to look at different implementations of these ideas, trying to identify conditions under which they may be more or less effective.
So thanks for the concluding remark there, because it ties in with the question, comment that I have very nicely. First, one point about Native American Grave Repatriation Act that leads into my second comment, is that in some senses that was not a happy thing for either the archaeologists as a community, and it certainly did not arise from a happy thing from the Native American communities that were involved. And what the institutional context that made that collaboration happen was that the act said that basically that science would have to stop if the Native American community that might be involved in a particular artifact or a particular remains didn't want that science to go on. So there was a very heavy institutional hammer behind this that led the archaeological community to engage in that kind of activity. Which leads me, I think, to a point where you were beginning to get to in the end of your last remark, that these different kinds of participatory activities, democratization or just participation, have important institutional contexts around their very specific implementation. And so my research group, for example, over the past several years, has done a participatory technology assessment with the US National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. We've done one for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and we tried to do one for the Department of Energy, and the Trump administration clawed back the grant because they weren't interested in the answers. But in the first case with NASA, NASA was actually interested in that pure public that you were describing because they exist in the midst of a highly informed public that's very narrow and not representative of the rest of the United States. And so they were looking for devices to get outside of their little bubble. On the other hand, what we were doing for NOAA was a case where NOAA was looking for local expertise in order to understand local adaptation to climate change. And we were basically, we were using roughly the same kinds of structures, but organized slightly differently for each of those clients. But the clientelistic aspect of these things, because that's, quite frankly, the only way they get funded to be done, is very important.
Thank you for your questions. I think the first issue that you mentioned is something that I was to some degree aware when I was developing my argument, but I think that it may have to be stressed more. It's quite possible that the need to address marginalization, for example, will outweigh the need to provide epistemic improvements. I think why this case is more interesting for that, because it shows how, in these conditions, those different motivations may coincide quite happily. So there was this collaboration project in British Columbia, quite fascinating, and I highly recommend looking at that book that I mentioned. It describes the course of the project and the main findings. So sometimes these things work out, and I think it will be interesting to try and find out how often they work out. I know about one other example that also seems to be quite happy in this respect. It's research on the involvement of Arctic indigenous peoples in research on climate change and climate adaptation. Again, in this case, there are community who should be involved for ethical and political reasons, because they are among the most potentially affected by climate change. There also a community that happen to be in possession of relevant knowledge and expertise. I think it's interesting to be looking for more cases like that. And the second example that you gave about the difference, about the different requests that different organizations may have, I think it's one of the things for which philosophers of science interested in epistemic improvement should be looking. It really makes sense to look for constituencies that may be interested in doing something similar to what philosophers propose.
So we have time for a last question, maybe a short question and a short answer.
Well, this is not real short, but I'll be quick. First of all, thank you for using my book and for the careful summary. I wondered if you could go back to one slide, the incompatible roles. I just wondered if you could explain this a little more, because I'm not sure why you say that people who are selected to represent a particular perspective cannot also represent the general public at large. Isn't that what it says?
I think this is...
In the first part, yeah.
I think this is something that has been identified as an element in many public participation initiatives. So those analyses of these initiatives that I have been summarizing, I have been looking at actual public participation exercises organized in different countries for different aims. And they argue that in many cases, this desire to keep different publics separate is clearly visible. And usually this desire is motivated something like that. So on the one hand, you want to use publics with relevant experience, or the publics who are stakeholders. But you also feel that those publics are different from ordinary people, because presumably the ordinary people do not have expertise, and presumably also majority are not as closely affected by those issues. So those lay experts are supposed to be different from the ordinary public. And so if you want to hear from the ordinary public, if you want to learn those unaffected perspectives, you have to be looking for that pure public. And obviously it opens an entire can of forms as well, because there are many criticisms of this idea of purity and disinterestedness, and there are many concerns how it may be unproductive in practice if you are looking for people who are distinguished by the lack of knowledge, perspective, experience, opinion, and so on.
Thank you, that clarifies it. A can of worms, no doubt.
Okay, thank you. We'll move to the next speaker.
Thank you very much.